Welcome back to session 2 of Unit 309 Project Management. So you should have uploaded your activity from session 1 where we looked at the project life cycle and project roles, and now we're going to move on to looking at delivering the project. And our main aim in this session is to know how to deliver a project. So as part of that, the objectives will explain the purpose of key project documentation. We'll compare a range of different project management tools and how they can be applied to a project. We'll describe how to manage resources to effectively deliver a project. Explain how to use those project management tools to monitor the project progress, and describe the importance of reviewing project performance at the end. So let's get started. Right then, throughout this session, we're going to look at project documentation, we're going to look at tools, and we're going to look at how they help manage resources, monitor progress, and ultimately help us review the project at the end, which we've said is important. So let's start by thinking about that project documentation. First, why is it so important? Well, you need to consider the end of the project, really, to think about that. If we go to stage 4, to the closure and review, even though most of the documentation will be created in stage 2 in the planning, because when we get to stage 4, we're going to need that documentation, otherwise we'll have nothing to review. We'll need to know that it's met its outcome, its objectives, the goals, the deliverables, and they're all the things that we will have decided at the beginning. And then through stage 3, the execution and control, if anything's changed, if progress hasn't been where it's supposed to be, we'll need all that recorded so that we've got something to come back to at the end to do the review. So that's why the documentation is massively important. And the documentation is going to differ depending on the situation or the project. But why will the project documentation differ? Well, it's going to depend on the organisation, the situation, the projects. They're all different. Organisations have their own processes and procedures, and there are different project management methodologies. So we'll outline some key project document for managing projects effectively. We'll identify what stage it could be produced and how it can be used. There's many different lists given linked to these different project management theories or models, things people might have heard of like Prince2, Waterfall, Agile, but we will consider a general list. And I'll also make the point that it's not necessary to have all these documents, but the information needs to be there somewhere. And it'll depend on the documentation, but we'll look at some key documentation, and there is some more information in the handout in the resources, which also tells you what sort of size of project they might be required on. So let's have a look at some key documentation. So table has appeared on the screen now, which sort of gives a list of key documents, and we'll just quickly go through those and outline them. So first, we've got the project business case. We talked about this at the initiation planning stage, and this document will provide the justification for investing in the project. Is it worth the time, effort and money? This is really where it gets kicked off, and it could be, like we said, it could be an email, it could be a great big long document, and it explains why the project is taking place, what the goals are, what the objectives or outcomes being sought are, and it needs input from all the project stakeholders. We then have a project plan, and really this is the key document for any effective project management. The plan basically also needs the business case to back it up because it's built on the business case. And while the business case offers preliminary information about the project, as we've just said, the plan offers the information regarding how we're going to do that and how we might achieve it. It specifies the details, the resources allocated to the project, the objectives and the schedule. And there are many different management software packages that are used, or it can be done manually. But the project plan is the proof that the project manager needs that everything has been agreed, and this is how they're going to go forward to deliver what the client wants. It also backs them up on getting their resources, whether that's time or budget, and it also is what we go back to monitor to look at determining whether things are being done when they need to be done and that the scheduling is correct. And then thirdly on the list there's the requirements definition. Another important document, but it might be part of the project plan. It gives clear, agreed details of the requirements, not the plan of how to get them, but the physical deliverables, benefits, the aspirations or solutions. And it may go further, and it may show an assessment of whether they're practical, whether it's achievable, and define what is needed for success, but not how it will be achieved, because that's in the plan. Very useful in larger, more complex projects so that things don't get muddled up with the plan. And it is something that you can go back to to get clarity if there's any difficulties in the project. But it aligns what was outlined in the business case really with what the project plan should be planning to deliver. Next on the list is terms of reference, or TORs as it says there. They typically specify the amount and type of work to be accomplished by the project, a governance document sort of establishing the relationship between all the project stakeholders at a strategic level, sort of defining the tasks, duties required by each individual sort of organisation or person, and they can't really be developed until the project has been identified, planned, because the document also links it to the activities, expected outcomes, the project budget, the working schedules, job descriptions, which are all included in the project plan. It can also be used as a document to judge performance, so do people meet the requirements that have been set out, and it could be sort of used to monitor the progression as you go along. The next on there is project role definitions. So what we're talking about here is what could be called a project staffing plan, but whatever it's called, it's a document that makes certain that the document has the right and sufficient human resources with people that possess the right talents, the knowledge, the experience, the skills needed for the job to be successfully done. So roles and responsibilities are key elements to support the project plan, and therefore they may be included in the plan. This definition might be in there, but as long as we've got something that tells us the plan of how the project will be staffed with the right people with the right skills. And then risk log or register, such as RAID, which stands for risk, assumptions, issues and dependencies, and we'll look at that when we look at the tools, but you need to understand that there needs to be a log there because risks in projects are cyclic and they need to be monitored. So it needs to be started at the planning stages and then it's monitored as we go through, because we need to manage the risk as we go through the project cycle by maintaining and monitoring the risk log. We'll be looking at the proximity of the risks, the likelihood, the seriousness of the impacts that they could cause, and all this needs to be categorized and monitored regularly as we go through the project. And as I said, we'll look at those tools because it's a tool that we can use for monitoring those risks in more detail as we go through. There may be some other documents that pop up, project monitoring records, things such as Gantt charts, progress reports, reporting on milestones, etc. And we'll look at some of those tools when we look at the tools in the next next part. You've got your end of project review, which obviously speaks for itself, and you might come across other things which are in a handout at the end, such as a project charter brief, which is just basically an outline of the project, what it's solving, the mission and how it's going about, and things like change control processes, which are about documenting and having a process in place in case there's any changes to the plan as it goes along so that it can be monitored and used. But as I said, there's a bit more in the handout, and the handout also gives you some idea of when these documents might be needed and when they might not, as in medium, large or small projects. Many key aspects in those documents we just talked about are going to revolve around resources, and resource can mean a multitude of things, everything from people, technology, equipment, budgets, materials and other supplies, venues and other physical facilities, and of course, an important one, time. And managing these effectively can have a massive impact on the project as an efficiency or cost to that project or the organisation, and that ultimately is the bottom line. And managing these resources nowadays often involves technology. We could be using resource management systems, but they are really just helping us to be systematic and to record and monitor the plans. And yeah, they're great, especially for the larger projects. But it really comes down to the project manager having a handle on three things. The first is allocation of resources. The second is aggregation of resources. And the third is effective scheduling. And just to clarify that then, so allocation is all about identifying what resources are needed by whom to complete the work, the quantities required, the amount of time and effort required, and that's normally done at the planning stages. Aggregation is all about, on a daily, weekly or monthly basis, looking at the total amount consumed at any point in time, seeing whether it matches up with the allocation. And then scheduling is about calculating the resources required to deliver the work when it is needed and when it's required, and readjusting or changing it based on the first two. So once you know your resource allocation, understand what your consumption is from your aggregation, you can then manage the scheduling more effectively and make sure that you're getting the most value out of those resources, so you've not got things laying idle when they could be being used, or people sitting around waiting for things when they could be made available to them. Right then, quick activity now before we start looking at the different tools we can use. We've looked at project documentation and how important it is to the project, and we've considered how we would go about managing resources, what the key things are to managing resources effectively. So for this activity, I want you to consider the project you'll be using for your Unit 312, the performance evidence. Again, as I said in the last session, if you're not sure what that is and what your project's going to be, then you need to speak to your line manager, discuss it with your assessor quite urgently, and review the 312 evidence guidance sheet and the resources, because really in this activity you need to give examples of what you're going to do within your project or what you've done in your project. So the activity asks you to explain what the purpose of the key project documentation is. So ensure that you include at least 2 examples of specific project documentation. So you don't have to do them all, you just got to do 2. You've got some more information in the resources and you can research your own organisation. And then secondly, identify at least 2 resource categories that are key to your project. So describe how you would manage them to effectively manage the project. So pick 2 categories. That could be time, it could be supplies, and then show how you're going to manage those effectively to manage the project, thinking about the allocation, the aggregation and the scheduling of them. Any questions, ask your assessor, and then once that's uploaded, you can come back and do part 2 of this session.